The alarm did not build slowly. It did not give anyone time to think. One moment the station was quiet, and the next every screen on orbital defense Platform 7 lit up red at the same time. Commander Yale Dagan was already moving. Before the first voice came over the intercom, she had been awake for 19 hours working through fuel rotation schedules in the back office, and the moment the lights changed, she dropped her coffee, stepped over a chair, and was at the central console in 4 seconds. Flat. That was not training, that was instinct. That was the kind of instinct you get when you grow up watching the sky and wondering if something is going to come out of it. Report, she said, not loudly. She never spoke loudly in a crisis. Loud meant panic, and panic was the first thing that got people killed. Lieutenant Owen Price turned from his station. He was 26 years old, the youngest officer on the platform, and at that moment his face had the color of old paper. 300 vessels, Commander, maybe more. They came out of transit jump 7 minutes ago beyond the lunar perimeter. They are not transmitting standard identification. They are not responding to hails. Shape of the formation. Siege pattern, he said, standard encirclement around a primary body, in this case Earth. Yale looked at the screen. 300 vessels was not a skirmish. 300 vessels was not a border dispute. And GT snorts. And GT 300 vessels arranged in encirclement formation around a single planet meant one thing. It meant someone had decided the outcome before they arrived. She pulled up the visual feed. The ships were enormous, not just large in the way that human freighters were large, built wide to carry cargo and fuel. These were large the way mountains are. Large, the kind of scale that does not seem real until you compare it to something familiar and realize the comparison fails completely. The smallest vessel in that fleet was 3 times the length of the biggest warship Earth had ever constructed. The largest, sitting at the far rear of the formation, was something else entirely. It was almost still. It did not move with the rest. It sat at the center of the rear line like an eye, watching from a distance, covered in markings that glowed softly even in the dark of space. That one at the back, Yale said. What is it? Price checked his readings twice before answering. Command vessel according to the energy signature profile matches the Veth Imperial configuration from the contact files, the ones Dr. Oz put together 3 years ago. Yale had read those files. She had read them twice, actually, because Dr. Priya Oz was the kind of writer who made you want to read things twice. The Veth Dominion, 5 species under one Imperial authority, 40 star systems, a history of expansion that stretched back 10,000 years. They had arrived at the edge of the solar system once before, 18 months ago briefly, and then pulled away without a word. Earth's council had decided, perhaps hopefully, that they were just looking, passing through. Not interested. They were interested. The broadcast came 40 seconds later. It came on all frequencies simultaneously, which was itself a message, because that kind of broadcast was not a conversation, it was an announcement. The voice was translated by the platform's interpretation system, which meant it came through slightly flat, the way all machine translations do, but the meaning was clear enough that flat delivery did not soften it at all. This message is addressed to the governing bodies of the planet, designated Earth and all associated human installations within the star system. The Veth Dominion has reviewed the status of your civilization and determined that your world is eligible for tributary integration into the Dominion structure. You will have 72 hours to formally acknowledge the authority of Emperor Veth Garel and submit a full accounting of your planetary resources, population, figures, and industrial capacity. Failure to respond within this period will be interpreted as a declaration of armed resistance, and the Dominion fleet currently in your system will act accordingly. This message will not be repeated. It was not repeated. The platform was very quiet for a moment. Then everyone started talking at once. And Yael let them. She gave them 30 seconds because they needed it, and then she said simply, "Enough," and the room went quiet again. "Get me a direct line to the war council," she said. Encrypted burst. Low signal profile, and someone get Dr. Ask on a channel. I do not care what time it is in Nairobi. Wake her up. While Price worked the communications board, Yael stood at the main screen and looked at the fleet. She had a habit, when facing a problem, of going completely still. Her second officer, Lieutenant Grace Holloway, had once told her it was unsettling to watch, like seeing someone turn into stone. Yael had taken that as a compliment. She was counting, not the ships. She had already counted those. She was counting something else. She was counting the distance between the command vessel and the nearest support ship. She was counting the spacing between the escort frigates that surrounded it. She was watching the way those escorts moved and noticing that they moved in a pattern, a slow, wide orbit that repeated on a predictable cycle. And GT snorts. And GT, not because they were lazy, because they had never had a reason to do otherwise. No one had ever threatened that ship. In 10,000 years of expansion, no species the Veth Dominion had encountered had ever been in a position to threat the Emperor's vessel. It was not a military asset, not really. It was a symbol. It was the center of gravity around which the entire Dominion psychology orbited. The Emperor was not a general. The Emperor was the reason the generals, VOD, and symbols, Yael knew, had a particular weakness. Symbols work because no one touches them. The moment you touch one, you have changed the story. The War Council connected 18 minutes later. She could see 5 faces on the screen, all of them senior to her in title, and all of them wearing the same expression. The expression of people who have just been handed a problem that does not have a solution. General Frank Aldridge spoke first. He was 61, broad-shouldered, a man who had spent 40 years preparing for wars that might come from other human nations, and who now found himself staring at something for which none of those 40 years had fully prepared him. "Commander Dagan, you have seen the broadcast?" "Yes, sir." "Then you understand we are looking at an extinction-level situation. If we respond with force, they outmatch us at a ratio that our best analysts are too embarrassed to put in writing." "I understand that, sir." "Then what is your read? What do we do?" Yael had been thinking about that for the last 18 minutes. She had been thinking about it since the moment she saw the command vessel sitting still at the rear of the fleet. "We do not fight their war," she said. We fight hours. Aldrich frowned, meaning I have a plan, sir. It is not a plan that will make anyone comfortable. It is not a plan that looks good on paper, but it is the only plan I can see. That does not end with Earth becoming a tribute world or a crater. She paused. I need Dr. O's, a small team, and access to the captured Veth shuttle that has been sitting in Bay 14 of the lunar yard for the last 3 years. The silence that followed lasted a long time. Admiral Carol Price, no relation to Lieutenant Owen Price, but with a similarly pale complexion at that moment, leaned forward. You are going to have to say that again, Commander. The shuttle in Bay 14, Yale said. I want to fly it home. She said it calmly. She said it the way she said everything in a crisis, without volume, without drama, with the quiet certainty of someone who has already done the math and does not like the other answers. The council stared at her. General Aldrich put his hand over his face. God help us, he said quietly. Tell us the plan. And Yale told them. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping. She laid it out piece by piece, the way she had been laying it out in her head since she first looked at that command vessel and noticed it had never, not once in its long and ceremonial history, been asked to defend itself. When she finished, no one spoke for a moment. Then Aldrich looked up. His expression had changed. It was not comfortable. It was not happy, but it was no longer the expression of a man who could not see a way through. You have 72 hours, he said. Use them. Yale nodded once and cut the feed. She stood for a moment in the quiet of the operations room, with the red lights still running and the Veth fleet still visible on the screens. And she thought about the Emperor's ship, sitting motionless at the back of the formation, patient and untouchable, absolutely certain that it would never need to be anything else. She thought, we have never done anything that anyone expected us to do. Why start now? Lieutenant Holloway, she said. Grace Holloway looked up from her station. Commander, wake up Bay 14 and get me Dr. Asai. 48 hours was not very long. It was not very long even for a decision that had already been made. It was especially not very long for a plan that required a captured alien shuttle to pass as a legitimate vessel inside the most heavily defended military formation that humanity had ever encountered. But it was what they had. And Yale Dagan had never once in her career allowed the distance between what she had and what she needed to become an excuse. The lunar shipyard Bay 14 was cold when she arrived. It was always cold, the kind of cold that comes from metal walls and recycled air and the specific absence of warmth that accumulates in places where things sit forgotten. The Veth shuttle had been sitting forgotten for 3 years. It had been recovered from a brief border engagement near the heliopause, disabled but largely intact, and brought back to Luna by a salvage crew who had been told to document it thoroughly and then leave it alone while the diplomats decided what to do with it. The diplomats had never decided, which meant the shuttle had simply remained catalogued and untouched while the rest of the solar system went about its business. It was smaller than Yale had expected. She had read the dimensions in the file, but dimensions on a screen were one thing and the actual object was another. It was perhaps twice the length of a standard Earth transport shuttle built in a curved, elongated shape that looked more organic than mechanical, like something that had grown rather than been constructed. The outer hull was a deep gray-green, and it caught the light of the bay lamps in a way that made its surface look almost like it was moving. "It is in good condition," said a voice behind her. Yale turned. Dr. Priya Ase had arrived on the first available transit from Nairobi, which meant she had been on a flight for 8 hours after being woken up at 2:00 in the morning, and she still looked somehow completely alert. Ase was 44, compact with close-cropped hair, and the kind of focused stillness in her eyes that Yale recognized immediately. Because she had it too, it was the stillness of someone who thinks faster than they speak and has learned to be patient while other people catch up. "You have been inside it?" Yale asked. "Several times," Ase said, walking toward the shuttle. "I spent 14 months studying it in the first year after recovery. The control interface is learnable. It took me about 6 weeks to map the navigation system well enough to understand the basic principles. I would not say I can fly it like a Veth pilot, but I can fly it." "That is good enough," Yale said, "because you are flying it." Ase glanced at her sideways. "I assumed as much when you said you needed the shuttle and you needed me. The only question I have is whether you actually believe this will work." Yale thought about that for a moment. It was a genuine question, and it deserved a genuine answer. "I believe it is the only approach that has any chance of working," she said. "That is not the same thing, but it is the only answer I have." Ase considered this and then nodded slowly, like someone filing information away. "I can live with that," she said. The rest of the team arrived through the morning. Yale had requested 8 people in total, and she had been specific about who she wanted. Not the best soldiers by conventional measurement, not the fastest or the strongest or the most decorated. She wanted specific combinations of skill and temperament, because the plan she was building required people who could operate under conditions that had no handbook. Sergeant Major Riku Tanaka was the first to appear after Ase. He was 40, compact and quiet, with the kind of economy of movement that comes from spending years operating in confined spaces. He had led a 6-person team through a contested highland region for 3 weeks with no air support and no resupply, and had brought everyone back, not because the conditions had been easy, because Tanaka had a particular relationship with difficult conditions, the relationship of a person who has met them so many times they have simply stopped being frightening. He looked at the shuttle and said, "Nice shape, practical." That was all he said about it. Lieutenant Grace Holloway came next, still technically Yale's second officer from the platform, but Snort's now operating in a completely different capacity. She was 29, from a family of engineers and leads, and she had a talent for reading mechanical systems that Yale had found useful more times than she could count. Holloway spent about 10 minutes walking around the shuttle with a handheld scanner before reporting that the hull integrity was good, the propulsion system was functional, and the life support capacity was sufficient for their numbers. The other 4 were specialists. Corporal Dan Wells, who was quiet and thorough and excellent at remaining invisible in spaces where being visible was a problem. Lieutenant Ben Ford, communications and signals, who had spent 5 years working with encrypted military transmission systems and had in his spare time, apparently become somewhat fluent in Veth trade speech. From Asai's published research materials, a fact he mentioned almost apologetically when he arrived. Medic specialist Kate Lynn, who came last carrying a bag large enough to suggest she had prepared for scenarios Yale had not mentioned, which was exactly the kind of initiative Yale liked to see. And finally, technician Sam Ackefer, who had been the primary analyst on the Veth shuttle from the moment it was brought in and knew its systems better than anyone alive except, arguably, whoever had built it. 8 people against a fleet of 300 warships. Yale stood in front of them in the cold bay and looked at each face and said, without preamble, you know what we are doing and you know the odds. I am not going to insult you by pretending otherwise. What I will tell you is this. Every force calculus in this situation assumes that we behave the way everyone expects us to behave. We are not going to do that. The Veth Dominion has spent 10,000 years expanding into new territories, and in that entire time, they have never encountered a situation where someone went directly for the center of command, because no one has ever been in a position to try. They have no doctrine for it. Their culture has no reference for it. Their emperor's vessel has no defensive protocols designed for what we are about to do, because the concept does not exist in their framework of possibility. She paused. We are going to exist in it for them. No one said anything for a moment. Then Tanaka said, what is the entry point for the command vessel? And just like that, they were working. As had spent the previous 8 hours on the transit flight pulling together everything she knew about Veth fleet formation protocol and translating it into a practical approach path. The Veth formation was designed to prevent external assault, heavily layered with overlapping sensor coverage and rapid response positioning for the mid-range vessel. The outer shell was essentially impassable for any human ship, which would be identified immediately by its energy signature and hull configuration. But the shuttle was not a human ship. The shuttle was broadcasting the identification signature of a Veth diplomatic courier, a class of vessel that moved between fleet elements with specific priority. Oz had spent 14 months with the shuttle's communication system and had documented the identification broadcast format in precise detail in a paper that, because it was classified, had been read by approximately 9 people, 8 of whom were now standing in Bay 14. The patrols follow a 30-minute cycle, Asa explained, projecting the fleet map on the bay's briefing screen. The gap between cycles is approximately 4 minutes. We need to reach the command vessel's exclusion zone within 1 transit window. I have calculated the approach path. It is not comfortable, but it is possible. Define not comfortable, Ben Ford said. We pass within 200 m of a Veth heavy cruiser at one point, Ase said. Ford absorbed this. And if they scan us at that range, the shuttle's hull will register as standard Veth configuration. The question is whether anyone looks at the occupants. She paused. The diplomatic courier classification means the vessel is typically crewed by Veth, specifically a lower administrative caste. If anyone does a deep bio scan, they will see human biology. There is nothing I can do about that. So we do not let anyone do a deep bio scan, Tanaka said. That is correct. How do we avoid that? By moving quickly, behaving like we belong there and not giving anyone a reason to look closely. Osa said this with the calm of someone who had done the calculation and accepted the margin of risk. The Veth fleet is operating on a predetermined schedule. They gave Earth 72 hours, not because 72 hours is necessary, but because it is the formal period required by Dominion protocol before an action of this scale. They are not expecting any response from us that falls outside the category of formal submission or obvious resistance. Anything that looks like neither of those things will take time to process. We are the thing they have no category for, Yale said. Precisely. They spent the next 14 hours running through the plan in detail and then running through it again and then running through the parts that could go wrong, which was a longer conversation. Yale did not minimize the risks. She never minimized risks. She laid them out plainly and asked each person individually whether they were still in. Each person said yes. Tanaka said it first and said it like the question was slightly unnecessary. Ford said it after pause that suggested he was doing math in his head and had arrived at an answer he could accept. Lynn said it while refolding a piece of equipment in her bag with great precision, as if she were already thinking about what came after. At hour 40 of the 72, the Veth Herald broadcast again. This time the message was shorter. It said, translated, "The Dominion awaits your response. The period is not yet expired. Your silence will be interpreted as preparation for submission." The War Council, following Yale's specific instruction, responded with exactly 4 words: "We are considering options," which was true. At hour 46, they boarded the shuttle. It was not loud. There was no ceremony. The bay doors opened and the shuttle moved out into the dark, and Yale sat in the secondary seat behind Osa and looked at the 300 ships arranged around her planet, and she thought about what it meant to be something no one had a category for. She thought about every time in human history when the answer had been, keep moving forward. She had always found that thought either terrifying or reassuring, depending on the day. Today she found it useful. "Contact in approximately 40 minutes, Osa said without looking up from the navigation panel. Her hands moved over the Veth controls with the careful precision of someone doing something they have practiced many times and are now doing for the first time for real. "Understood," Yale said. The shuttle moved into the formation. The Veth fleet was not silent. That was the first thing Yale noticed. In every depiction of space she had grown up with, space was quiet, the silence of distance, the silence of vacuum, but inside a fleet of 300 active warships, the electromagnetic environment was constant and dense, a thick weave of communication signals, navigation pulses, and the low steady energy output of hundreds of drives running in maintenance mode. It came through the shuttle's passive receivers as a kind of texture, not quite sound, not quite anything with a human name for it, but present in a way that was somehow more oppressive than actual sound would have been. Osa had warned them about this. She had said that the Veth did not experience the electromagnetic field of their fleet as background noise. They experienced it the way humans experience the presence of other people in a room, as a form of social awareness, a constant peripheral sense of where everyone was and what they were doing. The shuttle broadcasting its courier. Identification into that field was doing what a person does when they walk into a room where everyone knows everyone else and try to act like they belong there. The question was whether anyone would look directly at them. For the first 12 minutes, no one did. Yale sat behind Osa and watched the fleet map on the secondary screen, their position marked as a small moving point threaded slowly between the larger markers of the surrounding vessels. The nearest ship, a mid-range patrol vessel designated third-tier support by its energy signature, was approximately 800 m to their left. It did not alter course, it did not increase its sensor output. Tanaka was seated behind Yale against the curved rear wall of the shuttle. He had not spoken since boarding. His hands rested on his knees and he was looking at a fixed point on the floor, with the expression of someone running through a sequence in their head, quietly and methodically, the way a person reviews a route before they walk it. The rest of the team occupied seats in a silence that felt focused rather than afraid. Lynn had her bag open in her lap and was doing something careful and quiet with its contents. Osa's hands moved without pause over the control surface. Ford was monitoring the communications channels, one earpiece in his eyes, moving steadily across the small display in front of him. At minute 14, a signal came in. Osa heard it half a second before Ford did. Her hand stopped briefly and then continued. Patrol hail, she said. Her voice was steady. Third-tier vessel to our left, standard courier verification request. I have it, Ford said quietly. He pulled the Veth trade speech protocols from his memory, the way a person pulls a word they have studied but not often used, carefully, deliberately, making sure the shape of it was right. He spoke into the communication system in the Veth frequency, and the sound of it in the shuttle speakers was deeply strange, layered and harmonic in a way that human vocal cords produced, imperfectly but recognizably. The patrol vessel responded. Ford listened, then he said, they are asking for the courier's routing authority code. It is a standard secondary verification, PRIA, the code sequencer. Osa recited it from memory without looking up. 14 characters in the Veth alphanumeric system, which Ford translated and broadcast in approximately 4 seconds. Silence. Then the patrol vessel signal changed tone briefly and went quiet. Accepted, Ford said and let out a breath. Do not do that, Tanaka said from behind them, not unkindly. Save the breath for later. Ford smiled despite himself and went back to monitoring. They passed the first major threshold, the inner boundary of the fleet's mid-range formation, at minute 22. This was the point Osa had marked as the highest risk segment of the approach, because the mid-range formation was where the largest and most heavily instrumented vessels operated. These were not patrol ships, these were the main combat elements of the Veth fleet, and their sensor systems were proportionally more powerful. 200 m pass, Osa said, not as a warning, but as information. The heavy cruiser in approximately 3 minutes. Yale looked at the screen. The cruiser was vast, even at 200 m, which in space was a very short distance. It filled the visual feed entirely, a wall of structured metal and energy lit at intervals by running indicators in the Veth spectrum. It was not pointing its sensors at them. There was no reason for It too. The courier signal was reading clean. The approach vector was consistent with the expected flight corridor, and the Veth formation had been sitting in this position for more than 40 hours without any incident to raise anyone's attention. Level. The shuttle moved past the cruiser's bow at a distance that on Earth would have been close enough to shout across. Nothing happened. We are through the mid-range band, Osa said. Another minute. Entering the exclusion zone. The exclusion zone was a sphere of approximately 5 km radius around the command vessel. Within it no other ships moved. It was maintained not by any technical mechanism, but by strict protocol, a spatial expression of the Emperor's status, a gap that said this vessel does not participate in the movements of ordinary things, which meant that inside the exclusion zone there were no patrol vessels. There were no escorts running there. Predictable 30-minute cycles. There was only the command vessel itself and the space around it and the silence of a place that had never needed to defend itself from the inside. Osa guided the shuttle to the docking approach at the rear of the command vessel, following the bay configuration she had mapped from the shuttle's own navigation records, which retained a previous routing history from before its capture. The records showed this shuttle had docked here before, which meant the command vessel systems would have a recognition profile for it. The docking bay doors opened automatically. Yale looked at Osai. Osai looked back at her. Well, Osai said quietly, here we are. The shuttle settled into the docking cradle with a sound like a long-held breath being released. For a moment, no one moved. Then Tanaka unbuckled and stood and rolled his neck once, the way a person does before standing up from a desk they have been at for too long. Right, he said. Let us go introduce ourselves. The docking bay of the command vessel was large and almost completely still. It was maintained at Veth atmospheric standards, which were breathable for humans, slightly cooler than comfortable, with a gravity that was perhaps 90% of Earth standard. The lights were lower than Earth lighting, and in that light the structures of the bay had a quality that was both familiar and deeply foreign, functional in recognizable ways, but built by a geometry that was not quite human. The serval cast workers who maintained the bay were 8 in number. They were tall, slender, wearing deep blue garments that marked their status, and they had turned toward the shuttle the moment it landed with the particular attention of people who are waiting to receive a diplomatic courier. When the door of the shuttle opened and 8 humans stepped out instead, the reaction was not fear, it was not aggression. It was something Yale had no precise word for, a total suspension of response, the expression of beings encountering something that did not fit into any category they possessed. They stood still. Yale walked past them at a steady pace and did not stop. Tanaka was at her shoulder. The others spread out behind them in the pattern they had agreed on, Ford and Osai moving toward the communications array in the bay's side corridor, Holloway and Akefer to the secondary hatch that led to the vessel's primary systems, Wells and Lin holding the bay entrance point. The layout of the ship was not exactly as the pre-capture records showed. It had been modified, but the fundamental structure was consistent, and Osai had spent 14 months studying Veth vessel architecture and had drawn a working Model of the command ship's interior. From published Dominion records and comparative analysis, the Imperial chamber was at the center of the vessel. It always was in every Veth command configuration, not at the front where a military commander might sit to watch the battle at the center. The Emperor was not a commander. The Emperor was the Axis. They moved through 3 corridors. The ship was not empty, but it was not a military vessel in the operational sense. The staff they passed were administrative, ceremonial, or caste, and they had the same response as the docking bay workers: suspension, stillness, not because they were cowards, because nothing in their entire existence had prepared them for the specific thing they were currently looking at. They reached the entrance to the Imperial chamber. It was a large circular door, heavily decorated, currently closed. Tanaka looked at it for approximately 2 seconds, then placed his hands on the central mechanism, which Osa had described in detail, and it opened. The Imperial chamber was high-ceilinged and wide, lit by the bioluminescent sigils that ran the full height of the walls, and it was occupied by 12 ceremonial guards in full armor standing at specific intervals around the room, and by Emperor Veth Carol himself, standing at the far end on a slightly raised section of floor, looking at the entrance with an expression that carried no category for what he was currently seeing. The ceremonial guards moved. They were trained for presence. They were trained to look imposing at the exact distance from the Emperor that protocol required. They were trained for the slow, formal choreography of Dominion ceremony, the precise gestures of challenge and response that had governed this chamber for 1,000 years. They were not trained for the next 40 seconds. Tanaka moved the way he always moved, when there was no longer any point in moving quietly. He was not brutal. He was not frantic. He was simply faster and more direct than anyone in that room was prepared for, and in any confrontation, those 2 qualities together are very nearly everything. Within 40 seconds, the ceremonial guards were seated against the wall, a configuration that required them to remain stationary and harmless, and not one of them had been seriously hurt, and the chamber was quiet again. Yale walked forward. She walked forward until she was standing directly in front of Emperor Veth Carol, who was, as the file had indicated, approximately 8 ft tall, and who was looking down at her with an expression she had never seen on a human face and could not fully translate. It was not fear. It was something older and more complicated than fear. She looked up at him and she said, in the clearest voice she had, "My name is Yale Dagan. I represent the United Earth Defense Corps and the people of Earth. And you and I are going to talk." There was a moment. Then she reached for the communications unit on her wrist and opened a channel to every frequency in the system, Veth and human alike. "This is Commander Yale Dagan of the United Earth Defense Corps. I am aboard the Imperial Command vessel. I have your Emperor. I am not going to hurt him, but I am going to hold this channel open. And we're going to have a very different conversation than the one your Herald started 70 hours ago." She paused. "You have 30 minutes to connect your senior commanders to this frequency, or I am going to start describing the inside of the ship in detail to everyone who can hear me. Your Joyce." Outside the command vessel, the Veth fleet went completely silent. Then every communication frequency in the solar system began lighting up at once. Yale kept her eyes on Emperor Veth. Carol. He was looking at her with that expression she could not name, the one that was not fear, and after a long moment he said, in careful trade speech, measured and deliberate, "You came here in my ship." "Yes," she said. "From inside my fleet." "Yes." A pause. "And you are not afraid of me?" She considered that. "I have been afraid of quite a few things in my life," she said. "I find it is usually more useful to focus on what needs to happen next." The Emperor was quiet for a moment. Then, in a tone that contained something she could not quite name, something that sat between respect and the very first edge of uncertainty, he said, "What manner of creature does this?" Yale held his gaze. "The kind that has been in trouble before," she said, "and learned that the only way out is through." The first thing the Veth commanders did was demand proof of the Emperor's condition. Yale held up the communications unit and let Veth Carol speak. He spoke in Veth briefly, and she did not catch all of it, but forward listening on the secondary channel. And GT snorts. And GT told her afterward that the Emperor had said precisely that he was unharmed and in the presence of a human commander, and that no action was to be taken without his explicit instruction. That was the first surprise. The second surprise, to Yale at least, was what happened in the half hour that followed. She had expected the Veth commanders to react with controlled aggression. She had expected ultimatums, demands, the kind of formal escalation that Dominion protocol likely had a procedure for. She had prepared for that. She had her responses ready, calm and precise and immovable. What she had not expected was that after the initial communications burst, after the first wave of Veth voices that Ford described as, quote, the loudest silence I have ever heard, the channel went quiet, and when it opened again, it was a single voice, measured and authoritative, that said in trade speech, "We are listening." Just that, "We are listening." Osai, patched into the channel from the communications array, let out a breath. "That is a protocol response," she told Yale through the earpiece. "It means they have accepted the channel as a formal negotiation context. They are treating this as a diplomatic situation." Yale processed this. "Is that good?" "It means we have an hour," Osai said. "Maybe more." Veth formal negotiation protocol requires a minimum of 1 hour of initial statement and response before any action can be authorized. If they accept this as formal diplomacy, they have bound themselves to that protocol. 1 hour. 1 hour was enough. Yale stood in the center of the Imperial chamber with the Emperor standing 3 m away and 8 of her team distributed across the ship at the positions they had agreed on, and she began to talk. She was not a diplomat. She had never been trained in formal treaty language or the careful architecture of political agreements. What she was trained in was clarity, the ability to say plainly and without decoration exactly what she meant and what she needed, and to listen for the same in return. It was not a skill that came from training programs. It came from years of being responsible for other people's lives and understanding that the single greatest cause of unnecessary loss was unclear communication. She told the Veth commanders through the open channel what Earth wanted, not everything Earth could possibly ever Want, not a list of ideal future. Conditions, what Earth needed right now. Which was a withdrawal of the fleet and a formal acknowledgement that humanity's solar system was not eligible for tributary integration under any existing Dominion framework. She expected argument. She expected the formal machinery of Dominion protocol to grind against her position for the full hour and possibly longer. What she did not expect was Emperor Veth Carol at the 30-minute mark after the Veth commander on the other end of the channel had delivered 3 formal counter statements in the careful, layered language of Dominion diplomacy. The Emperor spoke. He had not spoken since the channel opened. He had stood in his chamber and watched Yale manage the negotiation with the stillness of a person who has spent decades observing people and is currently observing something unfamiliar. He spoke in Veth and Ford translated quietly into Yale's earpiece as the words came. The commander of the human force currently holding my vessel asks for withdrawal and recognition, the Emperor said to his own commanders on the channel. She has not asked for territory, she has not asked for resources, she has not made claims of superiority. She has asked only to be left alone. A pause. This is unusual. The Veth commander on the channel began to respond. The Emperor spoke again and Ford's translation came through. I am not finished. Silence. I have studied the expansion of the Dominion for my entire life, Veth Carol continued, and in that study there is a consistent pattern. Every species we have approached has responded to a show of superior force in one of 2 ways. Either they submit because their cultural framework tells them that superior force equals legitimate authority, or they resist directly because their cultural framework tells them that honor requires it regardless of outcome. In both cases, the logic is the same. The result differs only in how long it takes. Another pause. Ford was translating carefully, evenly, not adding anything. The humans responded in a 3rd way. The Emperor said they did not submit. They did not resist at the level of force. They came here, they came into my fleet in a ship we built, and they took me out of my own chamber, and the woman standing in front of me is currently conducting a formal negotiation as if this were a conference room and not the most significant breach of Dominion protocol in 10,000 years. A very long pause. I find I do not have a response in my existing frameworks. I am going to have to build one. Yale listened to Ford's translation and kept her expression still. Emperor Veth Carol looked at her directly. You knew, he said in trade speech, you knew we did not have a category for this. Yes, she said. How? She thought about how to answer that honestly and clearly. Because you have only ever met species that had been at peace long enough to reach space, she said. You assumed that the path to becoming a spacefaring civilization was through peace. It made sense. It probably was. For every species you met before us. She met his eyes. We did not take that path, she said. We carried everything with us, all of it. We went to space still arguing, still fracturing, still making mistakes. We had made 100 times before. We are not a peaceful civilization. We are a stubborn one, and the difference matters because a peaceful species, when faced with something overwhelming, calculates the cost of resistance and may decide to yield. A stubborn species does the same. Calculation, and then does it again. Looking for the answer it did not find. The first time. She paused. We found a different answer. The Emperor was quiet for a long time. Outside the ship, the Veth fleet had not moved. The 30-minute mark had passed. Then 40, then 50. The Veth commanders on the channel had stopped their formal counter-statements and were waiting. At the 1-hour mark exactly, Emperor Veth Carroll spoke again on the channel. Not in trade speech, in Veth Ford. Translated word by word as it came. The fleet will withdraw to the transit boundary. A formal recognition document will be prepared acknowledging the human solar system as a non-integration zone under imperial protection. The tributary integration protocol is suspended for this system indefinitely. He paused. This is my instruction. It will be followed. There was a silence on the channel that lasted several seconds. Then the Veth commander said simply, "It will be followed." Yale stood very still in the imperial chamber and looked at the wall for a moment because she needed somewhere to look. That was not the Emperor and was not her team. Grace Holloway on the secondary earpiece said quietly, "The fleet is beginning withdrawal movement. I can see it on the shuttle sensors." Yale nodded once. She turned back to Emperor Veth Carroll. "Thank you," she said. He looked at her with that expression. Again, the one she had never been able to name. She had a word for it now. It had taken her the entire conversation to find it, but she had it. It was curiosity. Pure, uncomplicated curiosity. The expression of a person who has spent 10,000 years thinking they understood the shape of intelligent life and has just clears throat discovered there is a shape they had not accounted for. "We will not come back to your system," he said, "not because you are strong enough to stop us." She waited. "Because you are something we do not yet understand," he said, "and the Dominion has rules about things it does not yet understand. We watch first, we do not touch." He paused one final time, and what he said was not in trade speech. It was not in Veth. Ford in her ear said quietly, "That one I do not have a translation for. The closest thing I can get is you are worth watching." Yale Dagan walked back through the corridors of the Imperial Command vessel with her 7 people around her. They walked through the docking bay past the serval cast workers who were still standing in the same suspension of response they had been in 40 minutes ago. And they boarded the shuttle, and Oss flew them out through the exclusion zone and back through the fleet, which was now moving slowly and with the measured dignity of enormous things toward the transit boundary. No one hailed them. No one scanned them. They moved through the withdrawing formation like a thought through a crowd. When they cleared the outer edge and open space stretched ahead of them again, and Earth was visible on the screen as the small blue point it always was from this distance, Yale sat back in her seat and looked at it for a long time. Tanaka said from his seat behind her, "That went better than I expected." "Than you expected, or than you said you expected?" Yale asked. A pause. "Both, actually." She almost smiled. Ford took out his earpiece and set it down with careful precision. "What do we tell the War Council?" "The truth," Yale said, "that it worked, that they are leaving, and that we need to begin building something more permanent before the next time." "There will be a next time?" Lynn asked. From the back. Yale considered this. "There will be something," she said. The universe is full of things that want to know what we are, we just have to make sure we stay interesting enough that finding out seems more worthwhile than assuming. She leaned forward and looked at Earth, getting slowly larger as they approached. 300 ships were leaving, not because Earth had won a battle, not because humanity had matched them in force or technology or the careful accumulation of empire. They were leaving because 8 people had done something that no one had a category for, and in doing so had forced a conversation that changed the answer. Yale thought about the Emperor's last words, the ones Ford could not translate. You are worth watching. She thought that is the only reputation worth having. She thought we should probably make sure we deserve it. And then she opened a channel to the War Council and said, "This is Commander Dagan, we are coming home. The fleet is withdrawing. Prepare for debriefing, and someone start drafting a framework for first contact protocol, because if we are going to do this again, I want a plan that does not require us to steal someone's spaceship." Admiral Carol Price's voice came back with what sounded very much like the careful restraint of someone who had been holding their breath for 72 hours and was only now allowing themselves to exhale. "Understood, Commander." And Dagan, "Sir, good work." Yale closed the channel. Outside the shuttle, the Veth fleet continued its slow and dignified withdrawal toward the transit boundary, each vessel moving with the careful precision of something that knows it is being watched. And in the far rear of the formation, the command vessel moved. Last of all, enormous and ceremonial, and still glowing softly with its living sigils, carrying its Emperor back through the dark between stars toward the 40 systems that called him master. And somewhere on that vessel, Yale knew, an emperor who had spent 10,000 years assuming he understood the shape of intelligent life was sitting with a question he had not had before, question without an answer in any existing framework, a question he would be carrying for a long time. What are humans exactly? Yale looked at Earth. She thought we're the thing that keeps getting back up. She thought that will have to be enough. It was.